For more than 1,000 years, Rome stood as the greatest power the world had ever seen. Its armies conquered continents, its roads connected nations, its laws shaped civilizations. But one day, the empire that seemed impossible to destroy finally collapsed. The question is not only how Rome fell, the real question is, why did nobody see it coming? At its height, the Roman Empire controlled almost the entire Mediterranean world, from the deserts of North Africa to the forests of Germany. From Britain to the Middle East, Rome was everywhere. The Romans believed their empire was eternal. They called it the Eternal City. Generations of emperors, soldiers, and citizens believed that Rome would survive forever. After all, how could anything defeat an empire that had defeated almost everyone else? Rome was not built only with weapons. Its true strength came from organization. Roman engineers built thousands of miles of roads that allowed armies and merchants to move quickly. Their aqueducts brought fresh water into cities. Their legal system influenced future governments around the world. Their military was one of the most disciplined forces in history. A Roman soldier was not just a fighter. He was part of a machine designed for victory. For centuries, Rome expanded, but the seeds of its destruction were planted during its greatest years. The empire became too large to control. Imagine trying to govern a territory that stretched across 3 continents. Messages could take weeks or even months to travel. A rebellion in one province could happen before the emperor even heard about the problem. Rome had conquered the world, but now the world had become too heavy for Rome to carry. The first major warning signs appeared during the 3rd century AD. Political chaos began spreading through the empire. Emperors were constantly overthrown by their own armies. In a period known as the crisis of the 3rd century, Rome had dozens of emperors in only a few decades. Many of them did not die peacefully. They were assassinated by rivals who wanted power. The empire that once showed unity now looked divided. At the same time, Rome faced growing pressure from outside enemies. For centuries, Roman armies had kept the borders secure, but now powerful groups beyond the empire's borders were becoming more dangerous. The Germanic tribes were increasing their attacks. In the east, Rome faced the powerful Persian Empire. Rome was no longer the unstoppable force that had defeated everyone before. It was fighting wars on multiple fronts while struggling with problems inside its own borders. To make matters worse, the economy began weakening. Maintaining such a massive empire required enormous amounts of money. Rome needed resources to pay soldiers, build infrastructure, and protect thousands of miles of borders. But as wars became more expensive, taxes increased, farmers struggled, trade slowed, many citizens began losing faith in the government. The empire was still powerful, but cracks were appearing beneath the surface. Then came one of Rome's biggest decisions. In 285 AD, Emperor Diocletian realized that one person could no longer control the entire empire. He divided Roman rule into 2 parts, the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire. At first, this seemed like a smart solution. The empire became easier to manage, but this division would eventually create a dangerous weakness. The East would become richer and stronger. The West would slowly begin to collapse. The fall of Rome was not caused by one battle, one enemy, or one emperor. It was a long process, a slow decline that lasted generations. And the most shocking part is that Rome was not destroyed by people outside its walls first. The greatest threat was already growing inside the empire itself. The empire that conquered the world was beginning to lose control of itself. And this was only the beginning. For centuries, Rome had been feared by its enemies because of one thing above all else: strength and unity. The Roman army marched as one. The government operated through a massive system of laws and administration. Citizens believed they were part of something greater than themselves. But slowly, that unity began to disappear. The greatest enemy of Rome was not standing outside its borders. It was growing inside the empire itself. By the 4th century AD, Rome was facing a crisis that no army could defeat. The empire was becoming too dependent on powerful individuals instead of strong institutions. Emperors changed constantly. Some were brilliant leaders, others were inexperienced, cruel, or simply unable to control the enormous empire they had inherited. The position of emperor became dangerous. A man could rise to the highest position in the world and still be killed within a few years. Generals with loyal armies often decided who would become emperor. The military was no longer only protecting Rome, it was becoming a political weapon. When soldiers realized they could place leaders on the throne, they gained enormous influence. Instead of fighting Rome's enemies, powerful commanders sometimes fought each other. Civil wars drained the empire's resources and weakened its defenses. Every Roman soldier fighting another Roman soldier was a victory for Rome's enemies. But political problems were only one part of the disaster. The economy was also beginning to collapse. The Roman economy depended heavily on agriculture, trade, and a stable currency. However, years of war and poor financial decisions created serious problems. To pay for massive armies and government expenses, emperors began reducing the amount of precious metals in Roman coins. The currency slowly lost its value. Prices increased. Citizens struggled to afford basic goods. A farmer who once could support his family with his work now faced higher taxes and fewer opportunities. Many small farmers abandoned their land. The cities that once represented Roman greatness started to weaken. Rome had always been built on the idea that citizens contributed to the empire. But as economic pressure increased, many people began feeling disconnected from the state. The empire was becoming something controlled by distant officials and wealthy elites rather than ordinary citizens. Another major problem was the decline of the Roman military. The legendary Roman legions of earlier centuries were famous for discipline and organization. But by the late empire, Rome struggled to recruit enough soldiers. The empire needed more and more troops to defend its enormous borders. Eventually, Rome began relying heavily on foreign soldiers. Many Germanic warriors were recruited into the Roman army. These men could be excellent fighters, but they often had stronger loyalty to their own commanders than to Rome itself. The old Roman military system was changing. The army that once represented Roman power was becoming a mixture of different groups with different interests. Meanwhile, Roman society itself was changing. The gap between the rich and the poor became larger. A small number of wealthy families controlled enormous amounts of land and influence. Many ordinary citizens felt abandoned. The idea of Roman greatness was slowly fading. But perhaps the most important problem was that Rome had become impossible to manage. The empire was simply too large. A decision made in Rome could take months to reach distant provinces. A military threat could grow for years before the emperor could respond. The Western Empire was especially vulnerable. While the Eastern Roman Empire had wealthy cities, strong trade networks, and important resources, the West was poorer and more exposed to attacks. The split between East and West created two different futures. The East would survive for nearly another 1,000 years. The West was heading toward disaster. But Rome still had powerful armies, it still had great cities, it still had millions of citizens. So why did it finally fall? Because Rome was no longer fighting one enemy, it was fighting many enemies at the same time. Economic decline, political chaos, military weakness, social division, all of these problems were slowly weakening the empire. And then, from beyond the borders, a new wave of enemies began moving toward Roman lands. They were desperate people fleeing from something even more terrifying, a force that would push thousands of warriors toward Rome, and when they arrived, the empire would never be the same again. For centuries, Rome had looked beyond its borders and seen the world divided into two groups: Romans and everyone else. The Romans called foreign peoples barbarians. They believed these tribes were disorganized, uncivilized, and incapable of challenging the greatest empire on earth. For hundreds of years, Rome was right. Germanic tribes attacked Roman territory many times, but Roman armies usually pushed them back. The empire had strong borders, it had experienced generals, it had the resources to survive. But by the 4th century AD, something changed. The enemies approaching Rome were not simply looking for conquest, many of them were running for their lives. And the reason was a new power rising from the east, the Huns. The Huns were a powerful group of nomadic warriors who moved across the Eurasian steppe with incredible speed and military skill. Their arrival shocked Europe.
They were different from any enemy Rome had faced before. They used mounted warfare, lightning-fast attacks, and terrifying tactics. As the Huns expanded westward, they pushed other tribes toward the Roman frontier. Thousands of desperate people began searching for safety inside Roman territory. Among them were the Visigoths. The Visigoths were a Germanic people who had been forced away from their lands by the advance of the Huns. They came to the Roman Empire not as conquerors, but as refugees. They asked Rome for permission to cross the Danube River and settle inside imperial territory. The Romans agreed, but instead of treating them as allies, Roman officials exploited them. The Visigoths were hungry. They lacked supplies. They were treated unfairly by Roman authorities who saw them as weak outsiders. The situation quickly became a disaster. Anger turned into rebellion. In 378 AD, the Roman Emperor Valens led an army against the Visigoths near the city of Adrianople. Roman commanders believed victory would be easy. They underestimated their enemy. The result was one of the greatest military disasters in Roman history. The Battle of Adrianople ended with the destruction of the Roman army. Emperor Valens himself was killed. Thousands of Roman soldiers died. For the first time in centuries, the world saw that Rome was no longer invincible. The empire could be defeated. This battle did not immediately destroy Rome, but it changed something important. The psychological power of Rome was broken. Enemies no longer saw Rome as an unstoppable force. They saw weakness. Over the following decades, barbarian groups continued entering Roman territory. Some became allies of Rome, some became enemies. The empire tried to use these groups as soldiers, but this created a dangerous situation. Rome needed foreign warriors to defend itself, but the more it depended on them, the less control it had over its own military. Eventually, some barbarian leaders became powerful enough to influence Roman politics. One of the most famous examples was Alaric, the king of the Visigoths. Alaric had once served as an ally of Rome. He wanted recognition, land, and better treatment for his people, but Rome refused to meet his demands. The conflict continued, and in 410 AD, something happened that shocked the entire ancient world. The city of Rome was attacked. For nearly 800 years, Rome itself had not been captured by a foreign army. The idea seemed impossible. Rome was the heart of the empire. It was the symbol of civilization. But in 410 AD, Alaric and his Visigoth army entered the city. They looted Rome for 3 days. The damage was not as destructive as later invasions, but the emotional impact was enormous. People across the empire realized something terrifying. If Rome could fall, then nothing was guaranteed. The ancient world was changing. The empire that once conquered foreign lands was now struggling to protect its own capital. But the fall of Rome was not only caused by barbarian invasions. The barbarians were not the only reason Rome collapsed. In fact, many historians argue that they were a symptom of a much deeper problem. A healthy empire could survive attacks. A weakened empire could not. Rome had spent centuries creating enemies, but its greatest weakness was that it no longer had the strength to fight them. And as the 5th century continued, the Western Roman Empire began to break apart piece by piece. Provinces were lost. Armies disappeared. Emperors became powerless. The final chapter of Rome was approaching. And the last emperor of the West was about to face a moment that would become one of the most famous events in history. A young ruler would lose the throne, and with him, an empire that had lasted for more than 1,000 years.
By the middle of the 5th century AD, the Western Roman Empire was no longer the unstoppable power that had once ruled the Mediterranean. The name Rome still carried enormous respect, its monuments still stood, its laws still influenced millions, but behind the image of greatness was an empire struggling to survive. The Western Empire was slowly losing control of its own territory. One province after another slipped away. Britain was abandoned. North Africa, one of Rome's richest regions, was taken by the Vandals. Without these lands, Rome lost valuable resources, taxes, and food supplies. The empire was becoming smaller and weaker every year. But perhaps the greatest problem was that the emperors of the West no longer held real power. Many were young, inexperienced, or controlled by by powerful generals who used them as symbols. The emperor's title remained impressive, but the person wearing the crown often had little ability to change Rome's fate. The final years of the empire were filled with political struggles. Military commanders competed for influence. Armies followed their generals instead of the emperor. The government became unstable. And then came the final emperor of the Western Roman Empire. His name was Romulus Augustulus. He was only a teenager when he was placed on the throne in 475 AD. His name itself seemed almost symbolic. The legendary founder of Rome was Romulus. The first great emperor was Augustus. Now, a young boy named Romulus Augustulus represented the final days of Roman rule. But behind the young emperor stood his father, Orestes, a powerful military commander. Orestes controlled the real power. However, his rule did not last long. A Germanic military leader named Odoacer demanded land and rewards for his soldiers. When Orestes refused, Odoacer rebelled. His army defeated Orestes, and in 476 AD, Odoacer entered Italy. The young emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was removed from power, but unlike many fallen rulers, he was not executed. He was sent into retirement. The Western Roman Empire had officially ended. A Germanic king now ruled Italy. The date 476 AD became one of the most famous dates in history. It is often called the fall of Rome. But the reality was more complicated. Rome did not suddenly disappear. The city still existed. Millions of Roman people continued living their lives. Roman culture, language, and laws survived. The Eastern Roman Empire, later known as the Byzantine Empire, continued for almost another 1,000 years. So why do historians still say Rome fell? Because something fundamental had changed. The political structure that had controlled Western Europe for centuries was gone. There was no longer a Roman emperor in the West. No single government united the former Western provinces. The old imperial system had collapsed. However, one important question remains. Who was responsible for Rome's fall? Was it the barbarians? Was it corrupt leaders? Was it economic problems? The answer is much more complicated. The barbarians did not destroy a perfectly healthy empire. They entered a system that was already weakened. Rome had been struggling with political instability, economic problems, military challenges, and social changes for generations. The invasions were the final pressure that broke an empire already under enormous stress. Think of Rome like a massive building. The cracks appeared slowly over centuries. The foundation weakened. The walls started breaking. Then finally, the final storm arrived. The storm did not create every problem. It simply revealed how fragile the structure had become. But even after Rome's fall, its influence did not disappear. In many ways, Rome never truly died. Its ideas continued. Its language evolved into modern European languages. Its legal traditions shaped future nations. Its engineering inspired generations. The empire was gone, but the legacy remained. And perhaps the greatest lesson of Rome's fall is this. Even the greatest powers in history are not destroyed in a single day. They fall slowly, from decisions made years before, from problems ignored for too long, from weaknesses growing inside their own walls. But one final mystery remains. If Rome was so powerful, if it had survived wars, invasions, and crises for centuries, could the fall of Rome have been prevented? Or was the collapse of the greatest empire the world had ever seen inevitable?
The fall of Rome remains one of the greatest mysteries in human history. For more than 1,000 years, Rome stood as a symbol of power, organization, and ambition. It built roads that connected continents. It created laws that shaped future civilizations. It developed one of the most powerful military systems the world had ever seen. So how could such a powerful empire collapse? The answer is not simple. Rome did not fall because of one enemy. It did not fall because of one battle. It did not fall because of one terrible emperor. Rome fell because many problems came together over hundreds of years. The empire became too large to control, its borders became too expensive to defend, its government became too unstable, its economy became too fragile, and its people slowly lost confidence in the system that had once made Rome great. But one question continues to fascinate historians. Could Rome have survived? Some historians believe the empire could have been saved. They argue that Rome still had enormous resources even in its final centuries. The empire had wealthy cities, experienced generals, millions of citizens, a powerful cultural identity. With stronger leadership and better decisions, perhaps the Western Empire could have continued. One possible solution would have been political reform. Rome needed a stable system for choosing and controlling emperors. Too often, generals used armies to seize power. This created endless civil wars that weakened the empire from within. A stronger political structure might have prevented decades of chaos. Another solution would have been economic reform. Rome needed to protect its farmers, improve trade, and create a more stable currency. A stronger economy would have provided more money for defense and government. The empire also needed a better military strategy. Rome's borders were enormous. Trying to defend every frontier equally became almost impossible. A smaller but more organized empire might have survived longer. However, other historians believe the fall of Rome was almost unavoidable. They argue that the empire had reached its natural limits. The same expansion that made Rome powerful also created its greatest weakness. Every conquered territory created more borders to protect. Every new province created more problems to manage. Rome became a victim of its own success. The empire had grown beyond what the ancient world's technology and communication systems could support. There was no modern transportation, no instant communication, no way for a distant emperor to quickly respond to every crisis. Eventually, the empire became too big for one government to control. But perhaps the most important lesson from Rome is that great civilizations do not usually collapse from one dramatic event. They decline slowly. The citizens of Rome did not wake up one morning and realize their empire was ending. There was no single day when everyone understood that history had changed forever. For many ordinary Romans, life continued. Farmers still worked their fields, merchants still sold goods, families still lived, loved, and raised children. The fall of Rome was a political collapse more than an immediate destruction of society. The world did not end, it transformed. New kingdoms appeared across Europe. Roman traditions mixed with new cultures. The old empire became the foundation for the medieval world. And centuries later, people still study Rome because its story feels familiar. The rise and fall of Rome teaches a powerful lesson. No empire is too strong to fail. Military power alone cannot protect a civilization. Wealth alone cannot guarantee survival. Great buildings and monuments cannot save a society if its foundations become weak. Rome was defeated not only by enemies outside its borders, but by the problems it could not solve inside them. The empire that once conquered the world eventually lost control of itself, but its legacy survived. Today, when we look at modern governments, legal systems, architecture, and languages, we can still see Rome's influence. The empire is gone, the emperors are gone, the legions are gone, but the ideas of Rome remain alive. And perhaps that is the greatest irony of all. Rome fell more than 1,500 years ago, yet in many ways, Rome never truly disappeared. The greatest empire in history was destroyed, but its shadow still covers the modern world.